The program over to Kim to introduce our speaker today.
So in a steering committee meeting for the coalition 6 or 8 weeks ago, we were talking about who to try to get who would be a very interesting speaker on public-private partnerships. Mike Kaspernak came to one of our last meetings, and Kathy Lazarus had reached out to folks she knows in planning and asked them who's really good. And she got back from everybody she talked to the name Bob Gamble. And I had a bell go off my head saying, Bob Gamble, I know a Bob Gamble. And did a little Googling to see if it was the same Bob Gamble. And we had met in about 2002 or 3 when Bob was executive director of the Richard Rhoda Goldman Fund. I was advancing a nonprofit web venture that eventually got crushed in the Great Recession. But Bob has a really illustrious career in what I'd say civic and public service. Prior to the Richard Rhoda Goldman Fund, he was the budget director for the city and county of San Francisco under mayors Dianne Feinstein and Art Agnos. He was chief financial officer of the San Francisco Redevelopment Agency. And since the Richard Rhoda Goldman Fund, he's been involved as managing director of PFM San Francisco office, where he focuses on public-private partnerships, advising cities on how to make things happen. So it's really, thank you so much for coming down today. I really appreciate it, Bob, and I'll turn it over to you so that
Great.
Absorb what you can tell us.
Great, thanks, Kim. Thanks for that generous introduction, and it's very nice to talk with all of you today. I don't like PowerPoint very much, but I'm going to kind of blow through a series of slides I've brought here for you. They're a little overly technical, frankly, but I'm hoping this can be a dialogue. I'd be happy to answer questions. So I'm going to try to go through the slides fairly quickly. I have some examples at the end that I think may be of greater interest to you because they're sort of real world examples and you probably know about some of them yourself. So let's get right into it. Just a little bit about my company. PFM is the nation's leading financial advisory firm. We have two main businesses. One is advising on debt issuances, and the other is advising on investments primarily for governments and nonprofits. So we managed about 1,000 bond transactions last year in the United States, which constitutes about 20% of the market. So that's pretty typical. We have been the leading advisor for the last 20 years. This is a little more focused on our P3 work, our value propositions. Really, what distinguishes us from a lot of the people in the P3 world is that we're not advocating for a particular solution. We're not trying to convince you to do a particular type of transaction. We are truly independent advisors, and we're just trying to get you to a result that you want to have. And so we'll talk more about how that works as we go through this. So the first part is going to be some very kind of high-level overview about P3s in general. And the chart at the bottom of the page really just shows the range of alternatives that are out there. One of the platitudes that you hear about P3s is that when you've seen one P3, you've seen one P3. And the reality is they're all custom built, and the successful ones have to be custom built. Failures generally occur in this world because you're trying to impose a preconceived model in a situation that doesn't fit. And so, in terms of the spectrum here, there's just a range of P3s from those which are really completely privatized situations where you're just essentially giving an asset over to the private sector and saying, go and do something with it, to those which are very controlled by the public sector. And then there's a whole range of arrangements in between in which there are compromises around all the contractual arrangements so that the objectives of the public and private sector can be met. And I'm not going to go through all of those, all of the acronyms on there. It's really pretty boring, but we can get into that later if you want to. In the United States, P3s have been kind of slow to develop relative to a lot of the world. Certainly, those who've been to Europe have seen a lot of privatized assets there, a lot more toll roads, for example. But there's a good reason for that. It's because we have tax-exempt municipal financing in the United States, and that generally produces anywhere from 400 billion to 800 or 900 billion of investment a year in the United States, and that's a very effective tool actually. And again, our perspective on it is that if it makes sense to use traditional public financing, you should do it because it's cheap relative to the investment of private equity and debt. But what we find increasingly is that there are a lot of situations where it makes sense to dovetail public and private financing techniques together, as well as to use private processes. Just a quick word on this. You probably heard some discussion from the president about wanting to do more public-private partnerships. We don't really know what that means, so that's about all there is to say about it. Everyone would love to see some real advocacy for this, but it's hard to know what it means. So I will say the Department of Transportation has done at least one specific thing that in their new funding guidelines, they have essentially said, with respect to transit-oriented development, which is a term some of you have probably heard, they are essentially suggesting or recommending strongly that local governments who receive funding from the Department of Transportation look at what they call value capture, which means using essentially upzoning and growth management to capture some tax increment value from value that's created by the department's investment. So that's one specific thing, fairly narrow and targeted. What situations does a P3 tend to work best in? So just some very broad examples. You see them certainly in what I call new or greenfield projects where you're building something from scratch and there wasn't something there before. One of the projects I helped develop a few years ago was the UCSF Neurosciences building, which is in the Mission Bay campus in San Francisco. And that was one where, obviously we're working with a relatively blank slate physically, and the entire Mission Bay campus was really being built on land that was essentially unutilized previously. So that was one where we essentially built a public-private partnership. And I will note that in that case, we did use actual completely public financing on that. So it was what we call a design, build, operate, maintain project, where the University of California actually provided the financing for it. And there'll be more about that example as we get into the examples more. An alternative situation where it fits, or where you have existing capital assets that you need to rebuild, renovate, reuse, produce better functionality for. I'm currently working with the city of Napa on essentially a revisioning and rebuilding of their city hall and related public facilities. And essentially what they have currently is a city hall located in downtown Napa, which is really has outlived its functional value. It's located on very valuable land because it's in downtown Napa. And so as Napa has become increasingly a tourist center, that land has great value for tourist-related purposes. So they are selling that land that the current city hall is on for development as a hotel. So that's part of the transaction, and then the city will move its facilities to another piece of land, also in the downtown, but a little further out. And they will develop city hall, police station, and fire facilities as well. So that's one where there are essentially two transactions linked together. The procurement was done as a single undertaking, so there's a single developer that's doing all of that. And that one will be primarily publicly financed, although there will be an element of private equity in it as well. Some of the financial considerations that drive consideration of P3s are concerns about how you can best, really the cost of capital. And so to the extent that you can reduce your cost of capital by including private investment, those are situations where it makes sense. There are situations also where the public sector may just decide that their balance sheet can't sustain the level of investment that's needed for a pure public procurement. And then Long Beach is an example of that. Some of you may have heard of the Long Beach Civic Center and Courthouse project, and that was really driven by the fact that Long Beach could not afford to finance this project on its own. So that one is in fact an entirely privatized project. A few examples: Long Beach Courthouse, there it is, right at the top. Wastewater facilities, there are quite a few privatized or semi-privatized wastewater facilities in the United States. The Essential Services Building I was just talking about in Napa, UCSF Neurosciences Building, which I mentioned before. Another project I'll talk a little bit more about later is the Mission Rock project, which most of you who've gone to Giants game know as the parking lot, the Giants parking lot. The Giants are developing that into a mixed-use facility. I'm the consultant to the Port of San Francisco, and so that is a sort of complex public-private partnership using both public and private sources. UC Hastings is a new project I'm just beginning to work on. Hastings, is a law school, a well-known law school in San Francisco, very successful law school, located in the Tenderloin, traditionally not the most desirable part of San Francisco. With all of the increase in land values and housing costs in San Francisco, Tenderloin land actually has become quite valuable. And so Hastings is is beginning the process where they will essentially redevelop a portion of the land that they own and control in the Tenderloin, use it for student housing and a variety of other purposes. So that's a really interesting project. Some of the financial structures, just so we get some overview of these and how they work. Again, there's a range from traditional tax-exempt financing alternatives on the left-hand side, potential use of 501c3 conduit issuers in the middle, private equity, and all of this relates to the level of risk and control that you want to have. And there's not a right or wrong place to be on that spectrum except where you want to be. And you need to understand your risks when you're getting into these projects and understand how much control you're willing to give up, how much you need to retain. And so that's a very fundamental choice that needs to be made at the beginning of the process. Some of the P3 parties that you typically see, and again, this is just sort of a hypothetical example up here. You have the government entity, you have the customers of the government, the so-called customers. This is really P3 speak here, unfortunately, which are really citizens. The project the desired project in the middle. Debt providers, those again can be public or private. The developers, of course, who may provide equity and other elements to the project. And then construction contractors and facility operators. A lot of governments are looking seriously now at using P3s to manage operations and maintenance costs over time. What we see looking back, and I've been in government for a long time, is a failure to maintain buildings properly over a period of time, to maintain assets. And so, and as a budget director, I know that those are the things that tend to fall out of favor in a budget process. It's always easy to postpone the roof for another year or to not maintain a building. So inevitably, the value and the condition of assets decline. A lot of cities and other government entities are really seeing a value in essentially recognizing that cost when you create a building and going ahead and dealing with that cost up front. And it's really a way of more transparently recognizing and managing the cost of maintenance over time. And so even in situations where we're doing public financing, a lot of cities want to include long-term operations and maintenance contracts for that reason. Another couple of charts here on the difference between sort of traditional financing and project financing. Nothing too difficult about that. We have the top sort of traditional tax-exempt financing and below project financing, which is debt and equity. Of course, oftentimes the sweet spot is somewhere in the middle of that. A couple of different approaches to creating revenues for projects. Sometimes there are user fees that are available. Sometimes the government entity can pledge so-called availability payments, which are really government revenues also. Sources of debt and equity, I'm going to kind of blow through this one quickly here. We can talk about that later. So this is a kind of a traditional municipal finance arrangement where you have a revenue stream coming in over time. You have to include coverage for that when you issue your debt. This one does have escalating debt service, which is possible, not necessarily that common. You actually more typically see a flat debt service schedule. And then on this chart we see one which is 80% debt, 20% equity. This is just again a hypothetical. The challenge, of course, is getting the right balance. Equity is relatively expensive. In some of the projects that I'm working on, I see equity returns of between 10 and even up to 20% in some cases, depending on the situation. And that's just a reflection of the risk involved in the project. So some thoughts about best practice. I'm going to dwell on this slide for a minute. This is a pretty important one, because this really frames how we think about these projects at the beginning. The first thing in the box at the top is really, I can't overemphasize it, it's really important to understand why are you doing this. It's really important not to do this because somebody like me told you to do it, or somebody who wants a project to happen and wants to invest in it wants to do it. It's really important to spend some time figuring out what's the purpose of the project. What are you trying to achieve here? Are you trying to achieve a lower cost of capital? Are you trying to achieve a reasonable maintenance of a facility over time? So it's just, if there's a place where you can fail very early in a process, it's not understanding your own objectives. So I encourage you, and it sounds like this is the right group to be thinking about this, really understand what you're trying to accomplish. Understand your stakeholders. Obviously, to the extent it's a public project, your stakeholders probably are fairly well defined, but again, important to understand that, to communicate with them clearly. Really objectively review the alternative delivery and finance models. That's where someone like me comes into the picture and really kind of helps you look at the range of alternatives, understand what their upsides and downsides are, understand what their costs are, understand what the risks are that you have to manage, understand how you can or can't manage those risks. And again, it's really important to have someone who doesn't have a stake in the outcome. I'll just give you an example. I mean, there are companies out there today that want you to do P3s because that's their business and they make money on them. I would encourage you not to take the advice of those folks. Their advocacy is understandable, and that's fine, but they are in the business of making money on P3s. You need to have advisors who are working solely in your fiduciary interests. Understanding the private sector interest and capability. Because the word P3 has become somewhat in vogue in recent years, we do see projects coming to the surface sometimes that really shouldn't be P3s, that someone has said, hey, this is a great idea, let's do it as a P3. The question is there any real feasibility of doing it that way? I'm hesitant, there's an example nearby here, but I don't want to use it because, but let me just say that if a project does not produce some value that you can capture, then you don't really have, necessarily a good way to do a P3. There needs to be some commonality of interest with the private sector, and you need to be able to capture that in some way. So if you don't have that, then you just have a traditional public project. Now you could do a private procurement for that, and there are different ways to do that. So I would just be careful about that. And then executing a disciplined, transparent, competitive procurement. These procurements are typically long and complicated. It's good in the sense that there's usually a lot of interest in them. So there's typically an RFI, or request for information, then possibly an RFQ, request for qualifications, and then eventually an RFP, a request for proposal, and that's when you select, the developer or the other private parties that you're going to work with. So those processes can take, a year or more to undertake. There's a lot of brain damage associated with them, and again, that's why you want to make sure you know what you're doing before you start that, because you can spend a lot of time and energy doing something that's not very valuable. Balancing the different components, obviously the revenues that you need to have a clear understanding of your revenues and the revenues of the project. The development cost piece is of course something where you need to have very careful vetting of the cost. You need to have good engineers and planners working with you. The operating expenses, again, is an increasing focus of this sector because understanding life cycle costs of an asset, are really good to know. And it's good to know regardless of how you're financing a project. And of course, the cost of capital is very fundamental. Again, part of my work is very much focused on driving the best cost of capital for you. Risks of the project, obviously, this is theoretical, but they are typically higher at the beginning and decline over time. The early years of the project clearly are the most risky, where you're still involved in planning. The construction process is inherently risky. There are many standard approaches toward managing this risk and mitigating it, and all of those should be brought to bear on a project. Once the project is underway and has moved into stable revenue generation and management, then the risks are much lower. This has got a lot of words on it, and I think I'm just going to kind of blow through this one. We can come back to it if we need to. This is kind of, this also has way too many words on it, but I'll just start at the top. The initial phase of it is just focused on analysis and evaluation and really understanding the feasibility of a project. And, we do not hesitate to recommend that you not do a P3. There's really, there are many occasions where that is the right thing to do. If it does make sense to actually pursue one, then we would go to the next stage of essentially, writing the RFI, the RFQ, and the RFP, helping manage that process. And we don't do all of that. That's a team approach. Obviously, the public sector has to be very involved in that. It's important to have a great lawyer working with you, a great engineer, a really smart planner. So these are typically large teams that run these processes. I've already said this: RFI, RFQ, RFP. Again, that can be a very long and involved process. You want it to be competitive, of course. So in the early part of the process, you're really encouraging interest of vendors and bidders in the project. At the end of the process, the hard thing is making a choice, and sometimes the choice is not that clear. But eventually, you make it and you move on to the actual execution. So a few examples. This is where I was hoping to get to. City of Napa, I've talked about some already. This is a case where they are now. We've moved past the selection process. Plenary was selected as the vendor for this project. They're building both the hotel and the new city facility. We are in the midst of, we're very much in the trenches of working out the contract with them now. That's one of the difficult things about making a choice of a vendor, is that then you've lost some of your negotiating leverage. So you really are just kind of in a head-to-head negotiation, and you have to make that work, and it's important to be tough in that process. UCSF, I've talked about some already. Again, this is in the Mission Bay campus, the neuroscience building. We sort of created a model for this one that's built around having a 501c3 conduit issuer operating on behalf of the University of California, issuing public debt, but having a private vendor who's selected to build the building, to operate it and maintain it over a long period of time, and then give it back to the university at the end of the financing, which is 30 years. This was done in 2012. So we actually used Build America bonds for it, which you may remember was form of financing that existed for 2 years after the Great Recession as part of federal legislation. We actually did a second transaction last year, child psychiatry building, also on the Mission Bay campus, using the same model. Hastings, I've talked about a little bit already. Really fascinating project, because it's really a project that's built in a very challenging urban context. It does actually have multiple ownership involved too. Hastings is partnering with a couple of its neighbors to do this. One of the buildings in this project is, you may remember it, you may have noticed it when you're going to the theater. So I mean, it's a very tall building there. It's about almost 40-story building. And that was built in the mid-30s. At the time, it was the tallest building in San Francisco. And Hastings had acquired it some years ago. It's in terrible shape. It has a great room at the top, though, which is potentially the best bar in San Francisco. So it has a lot of potential, I think, a lot of upside, but it needs a lot of investment. So it's a really interesting project. The other thing that's interesting about this, actually, is that the law schools are a tough business these days. It's hyper competitive. Hastings has consciously lowered its enrollment And so it's an interesting sort of tail wagging the dog situation potentially, where the value of this real estate is probably greater than any valuation you could put on the law school itself. So, you know, the law school has been very careful and deliberate about this, and I give them a lot of credit for it, about how to use these assets to really sustain themselves over a very long period of time. And they're being very, you know, strategic about that. Port of San Francisco, I work with a couple of projects there. One is Pier 70, which is the one we've shown here. And the other, actually, these are mixed together, really two projects. One is Pier 70. Pier 70 is the area that's sort of southeast of Mission Bay. It's on the bayfront. It includes some of the oldest buildings in San Francisco, some buildings from the 1850s, actually. They're historic buildings. A lot of ship repair was done there over the years. So the developer for that is actually Forest City, and they are involved in a very complicated, you know, renovation of that property. This is also complicated because it's on state lands. The Port of San Francisco is all essentially owned by the state of California, and so all of this has to be done via a long-term lease. There's no transfer of ownership that's possible, and that does make the financing fairly complicated on this kind of a property. Similarly, the Giants parking lot, which I mentioned before, so all of that, you know, Lot A, Lot B, Lot C, that's sort of south of the ballpark, is this big plot of land in the middle of San Francisco, and the Giants have recognized that that is valuable, and they intend to develop it. So, again, we're working with the port on developing a financing plan for that involves community facilities district, an infrastructure financing district, and also very substantial private debt and equity coming into the project. So there's a rather complicated sort of stack of financing that operates for both of these projects. If you'd have asked me 10 years ago, I probably said this was impossible. It just seemed too complicated. So I don't recommend it as a model for you to think about, but it's just kind of an interesting case study. Treasure Island, another project in San Francisco. Really challenging project because it's located on an island that's seismically unstable, on a bridge that is beyond maximum capacity. Why would you do something there? Well, it is land, and so the developer, yeah, so far, I mean, one of the fundamental investments that's required there is shoring up that land. The first time I heard the geotechnical report on this project, they said, well, it's sort of like a bowl of cereal. And in an earthquake, the sides of the bowl will separate and the land will go like that. So it wasn't an encouraging thing to hear as someone who's particularly focused on finance. So obviously what they're going to be doing is strengthening the sides of that bowl, and that's a really big investment, You have to have tremendously high land value to make that feasible. But interestingly, it does pencil out, and the developer is Wilson Meany, working with Lennar. It's, as you would guess, a pretty intense development. There are going to be towers there. There's one tower that, it's a little hard to tell from that rendering there, but it's actually supposed to be taller than the nearest tower of the Bay Bridge. So I don't know if that will really happen or not. If I were an architect, I probably wouldn't have proposed that, but it's a really interesting project. Again, really high cost. Another one of the unusual costs associated with that is they have to essentially create, you know, permanent ferry service because you can't put more cars onto the bridge. So very challenging project, but it does pencil out. The developer is moving forward with it now. They're, you know, planning to start it later this year. And the other thing I would mention about the three San Francisco projects, the Giants project, Pier 70, and this one is that they all have to deal with sea level rise because they're all essentially at sea level. And so one of the pieces that we've had to build into this is a provision to create a long-term tax stream to allow for ongoing investment in sea level rise. We're doing that through a Melrose district in all of those cases. So it's an interesting technique. But when we originally started talking about the term of the Community Facilities District, we started with a discussion of 999 years, and we eventually arrived at 125. There's no magic to that, but it's kind of an interesting theoretical discussion of how long we'll have to pay for sea level rise. This is a project we're in the midst of now, the Central Soma project. This is tied to the long-term planning process about focused on South of Market. And it's also an interesting project because it involves multiple ownership in a complex urban environment. It's easier to do a project if it's on a single parcel or a couple of parcels. When you get into a situation where you have hundreds of parcels that are owned by a lot of different parties, it's inevitably just more complicated to reach consensus about what you're going to do. But the primary focus here, the basic proposition here is that a portion of the area of South of Market is going to be substantially upzoned. I don't know if you know what the San Francisco Flower Market is, but there is, that has been upzoned to about 40 stories. And so you're going to see a series of towers rising from that area around the Flower Market. And by essentially upzoning those parcels, you're creating tremendous land value. And the idea here is to work with the developers of those projects to put a community facilities district in place there that will allow capture of some of the value from that upzoning and to use it for creating community benefits for the larger South of Market area. So that's kind of the simple version of how that is playing out. And that's all in process now. The plan is supposed to be approved this summer. The CFD will also go to the Board of Supervisors this summer, and we'll begin after that. So, as you can see, there's just an almost infinite variation of different types of projects and different kinds of tools that can be applied to the project. You have a whole range of sort of traditional public finance tools. You have all of the creativity of the private sector that can be brought to bear in their financing capacity and their know-how. So, again, for each project, you have to figure out how to dovetail those pieces together. And that's really the challenge of each one of these. So I'll stop, take a breath, and try to answer any questions you may have.
Bringing it down to home, first of all, this was incredibly fascinating. It's fun to see behind the curtain and see which levers are back there and see how they're really being manipulated for the things that we're...
We don't try to keep it a secret.
No, but it's just most of us have no clue how any of these developments are taking place, and so that's just fascinating. But bringing it close to home, we've got two situations in the city right now. We've got a developer with a large chunk of underused land that is trying to figure out what to do with it. And we've got a city that would like to have a new city hall at some point and has a fair amount of land and hasn't begun to reach out yet to find contractors for them. So two very different kinds of projects. One, a developer looking for the public side, and the other, the public looking for a private side. Is there a difference in the approach of these two? What should the general group here be thinking about?
I would say on the private parcel, the question there is, what are the potential uses of it? I mean, I think there's a public vision question about, what does the city want to have happen there, or what are the choices, and then sort of how do you realize that vision then? I mean, there are potential public financing mechanisms you could use, or regulatory mechanisms you could use to encourage the development of the private parcel in various ways, and also to capture value from that project, after it's built. Again, the CFD is a possibility. Infrastructure financing district would be a possibility. Perhaps both of those, or maybe nothing. Maybe there doesn't need to be anything done there. I mean, I think the threshold question is how much push do you need to have to achieve the objectives you want to achieve? So that would be just my first take, knowing almost nothing other than what you just said about that project. On the city project, I mean, on the face of it, that would appear to be a more straightforward project, but you need to know more about sort of the context, the land around the city hall. Is there potential for a public-private partnership based on value associated with the project itself? Can you capture that value in some meaningful way and contribute that to the public cost, to mitigate the public cost. That would be somewhat analogous to the Napa project potentially, but we have to understand what the potential is for that.
I had a question, returning to your last example about cell mining. Did you say there were about 100 private parcels?
There are probably more than that. The kind of the large development parcels, there's probably actually only about 15 of those.
Okay. So is the whole area going to be put into this special district? And I'm wondering...
Community Facilities District, yeah.
So I'm an individual landowner and I've owned it for 60 years and now I'm in this district.
Right.
I've been like...
Do you have to start paying more taxes?
Yes, so what's happening? Do I pay more taxes?
Yeah.
What happened to the depreciation I was expecting on this land that I've been holding for 60 years? What happened?
Good question.
To those people?
Yeah, so the Community Facilities District can be constructed in such a way so that you have a phase-in of taxes over time, and that you only tax those parcels where there is, an upzoning. So most of the owners in the district will not pay additional taxes, but the ones that are experiencing this upzoning will obviously contribute.
Did they volunteer to be upzoned?
Well, yeah, okay, so they're making a lot of money. If you're being upzoned from 4 stories to 40 stories, they are making a lot of money.
So why were these parcels selected and the other ones weren't? I guess my next question.
Well, I'm not a city planner,
Okay.
so I'm not sure I can fully answer that question, but there at least, this is a product of a 7-year process, so I'm sure it was heavily negotiated, but I think the fundamental question around upzoning in South of Market, it really has a lot to do with what's the right level, how much can it tolerate. If you've tried to drive in that part of town recently, you're probably very unhappy. So the impacts of development there are very significant right now, and again, if you're going to create more intense development, and that is still kind of the overriding planning philosophy of the city, is that more intense development is a good thing. You have to figure out how to mitigate the impacts of that. So as to how individual parcels were selected, I can't really tell you that.
Maybe the transit people worried about that.
Absolutely. Transit's a huge consideration. Yeah.
Other questions? I like your graduate of Hastings. It was very interesting to look at that. I remember sitting in the cafeteria one morning and some poor homeless person wandered in and thought they'd gotten to heaven. Is this food free? But yeah, it's very interesting.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
You talk about equity instruments. Can you describe sort of the relationship between equity and some of the other alternatives? I think that we've had almost no experience with. Thank you.
Yeah. So equity is a two-edged sword. The value of it is that it's available up front. The timing of the equity contribution is very important. It obviously bears a much higher return, partly because it's early money. The other thing it accomplishes, I think, from the public side, is it begins to get the investor. It puts so-called skin in the game for the investor. It gets the developer committed to the project, and hopefully creates an incentive for them to move forward. I mean, I didn't get into this, but one of the concerns about these projects is always, what happens if you're 3 years into it and something bad happens? It's a terrible recession, the developer begins to have cold feet. How do you need to create mechanisms to hold their feet to the fire. And so in that situation, for the developer to have equity is helpful because it helps keep them in the game. It doesn't absolutely ensure that they'll stay in the game, but it makes it more difficult for them to walk away. Yes?
A corollary to that question, generally when real estate developers do single-purpose entity LLCs, and
Right.
I assume they'll
That's right.
wrap an LLC around a project like this.
Right.
Is there any mechanism for getting any further guarantees
Yeah.
from the parent company. I mean, because
Right.
sometimes the holding company or parent company actually have some sort of at least commitment in case, so they don't just fold the LLC and say,
Right.
sorry, and walk away.
That is absolutely a classic problem, and you face it in every project. So there are several mechanisms to do it. The one you mentioned is the least likely one, actually. They pretty much will not do that. But the things you can do, the things you have to do are several. Obviously, having a third-party guarantee of some kind is good. A letter of credit is a great thing to have. That's a pretty standard mechanism. Another one is a so-called liquidated damages clause, and this gets into a higher level of lawyering than I should be doing. But you have to have a liquidated damages clause that is bankruptcy-proof, and that they just can't walk away from. I have seen those be successful, though. I think they can work. I think those are kind of your two best mechanisms to have in those cases. But this gets into a very high level of contract writing that that's why I would really emphasize having a great lawyer on your side is critical in this. Yes.
Another one, trend question. So not unlike a lot of communities, we're beginning to recognize that, particularly for city employees, teachers, that there is a big lack of affordable workforce housing. And so the trend question, what are you seeing? I noticed that you mentioned Hastings, and that was student housing. What are you seeing in terms of interest in putting housing in some of these projects, number one, and what implication does that have in terms of financing?
Yeah, tough question. I would say everybody wants to do it. Every city I'm working with wants, more workforce housing. And it's really hard to do. It is inevitably an economic burden on a project. It's something that when I was talking about setting objectives at the beginning, very critical to take that into account at the beginning, because there can be a tendency in some of these projects to Christmas tree them, to keep adding good public benefits to them, which everybody wants and agrees to. The more public benefit you create, the more cost there is. But absolutely everybody wants to have workforce housing and affordable housing. I'm going to take a moment for a little rant on the side here, which is that the system for creating affordable housing, workforce housing in California is broken now. There's an old model that has been used for most of my career that is simply not working. It's based on federal tax credit programs. Those tax credit programs in the old days provided a portion of the subsidy, but the other portion, the subsidy usually was locally provided or provided by the state of California. The state of California got out of it a number of years ago. That money's gone. Cities don't have the money to contribute to it. A lot of money came from redevelopment. Redevelopment's been gone 7 years now. Whatever money was left from redevelopment is now gone. There's no subsidy to match the tax credits. Nobody's able to create affordable housing. It seems to me it's a political crisis at the local level, and it's beginning to climb up to the state level as well. I have heard that there is legislation that's going to be proposed in the state legislature this summer that could address that, but I don't know what it's going to look like. So it's a problem. I wish I had a great answer for you. I don't. All right, I've solved every problem.
So I'll keep asking questions. So let's do Napa as an example, right?
Yeah.
And again, to make it somewhat relevant for this group. So how do community organizations get involved once the project is defined? Many of the tools you've talked about today, 85% of us in this room don't know what they are, and probably won't take the time to school up, and maybe we won't be able to get a turnout to teach people how to read a balance sheet. So how do community organizations get involved once this project goes to its city council and comes to the voters or comes to city council?
Yeah. Well, obviously that's a lot of the job of the city is to provide as much transparency during this process as you can. I think again, having really good transparency at the beginning of the process is really important so the objectives are clear. And then as you go through the process, if you decide to move forward with some sort of either a public project or a P3 type of project or some mixture of both, you should have opportunities for public review at several points along the way. During, certainly again with Napa, for example, intense public review at the RFI stage of the process, intense public review at the RFQ. And actually, interestingly in Napa, by the time they got to the RFP and the final selection of the developer, I was there, it was a long hearing, but it was there was kind of consensus around it. So I think as long as there are ongoing opportunities for transparency and for involvement in the process, and efforts to educate the community both through public hearings as well as through just dissemination of information on the website and so forth, that's at least the way you get that conversation started, I think. And it seemed to have worked pretty well there. A lot of my examples were in San Francisco, but I really do a lot of work with smaller and medium-sized cities, and they've undertaken these processes, and they seem to go pretty well for the most part. I mean, at least that part of it. So,
and delegated to ad hoc committees with skilled people, to planning, oversight solely at the city council level. What works better?
Yeah, at least in Napa, it was primarily the city council with a lot of work sessions. So obviously not bringing decisions forward, on the night that you want to get a decision, but providing several hearings and opportunities for people to come forward and ask questions and for there to be information given.
Are there other examples that you have of suburban cities, more like a Los Altos, that have undertaken these projects successfully?
Not a lot that have actually done them yet. There are a lot that are in discussion. I was telling Kim, I was talking with Santa Rosa yesterday. As you might guess, they have some unusual problems because of fires, but they do have some opportunities to do something like this. And they actually also may have an opportunity to seek special state legislation because of their situation. So for discussions with them, I mentioned to Kim Burlingame, which has, from what I understand, is a situation not that different from what you have. They have a downtown, they do have problems with their city hall. They probably need to get out of their city hall. They have parking lots sort of around Burlingame Avenue that are very valuable. The old post office is there. The federal government is actually, now willing to sell that post office, although that, I know from other cities I've worked with it, that can be a very long process. So anytime you're dealing with the federal government, it's going to take a long time. Trying to think of others. Pleasanton is another city I'm working with now that also has sort of a early 1960s style campus for its public facilities, close to downtown, so it's pretty valuable land. So they're thinking about sort of how to consolidate their public uses and to reutilize their land. So there's a few examples. I mean, I think it is interesting to me that there are a lot of cities have these older civic centers that the functionality that they need has changed over time. The value of the land has changed over time. The context that they're in has changed over time. Their own views about what they want their city to be has changed. So that's creating some interesting opportunities to do some different things. Yes.
With the Tenderloin project, did you have given a sense of it that all of the current tech versus tech gentrification versus residence issues were there public charrettes that were held, or besides hearings, the official city hearings, was there outreach to the community through charrettes and things like that?
Yeah, Hastings has a very complicated relationship with its neighborhoods. I guess you know from having been there. One of the things that's odd about it is that it's not subject to local zoning or planning controls at all, because it's a state agency. So that has created a lot of paranoia in the community about that, probably justifiably. So, but it's also made Hastings more careful about how they do that. And they actually have done a very good job, I think, of communicating with the neighborhood and with City Hall. And they've done it because they've made mistakes before. They've had a lot of difficulty. So at least on this project, they've done a really good job of talking to people about it.
When you've seen projects go bad, what are the themes of what went wrong?
Yeah. Oh, there are so many. It's one of my areas of great expertise. I've seen situations where developers simply decide to stop because they just decide that there's some better opportunity out there. That's one of the most confounding ones, because it's not because of general economic conditions, it's not because the pro forma of the project has changed, it's because they've just decided they have something better to do. That one is a really tough one. That's the kind of thing where you just have to really hold their feet to the fire in every way possible, sort of financially, using kind of public pressure, reputational pressure. So that one is a really bothersome one. I've seen situations where, again, not because of general economic conditions. Well, I'll give you one specific example. When I was at the San Francisco Redevelopment Agency in the early 90s, we were in the process of finally moving forward on Yerba Buena Gardens. And as you know, it did get built, kind of shockingly. But it was very difficult. It was a very fraught process. And in the early 90s, we were in contract with a company called Olympia in York, which you may not remember. At the time, it was the largest real estate company in the world, and the highest market capitalization of any company in the world. And I remember sitting across the table from Olympia in York in negotiations and saying to them, what would happen if you guys just decided to go away or to go fishing or something and just not be interested anymore? They laughed. They said, "Oh, that would be really interesting." 18 months later, it got really interesting because they basically overextended their investment in the Canary Wharf area of London. They went bankrupt, and it wasn't because general economic conditions were bad in San Francisco. It was because they literally overspent their capacity, despite being the world's largest real estate company. So that was an interesting lesson. And by the way, we had a liquidated damages clause that had been very well drafted, and they paid us $28 million like a week before they went bankrupt. So I'm not sure why they did that actually, but they did, it worked, and we were very relieved. So that's another example. The most common thing is just general economic conditions. I mean, if you hit a terrible recession, like we had in 2008 to 11, there's not much you can do about that. I mean, realistically, projects get delayed during periods of time like that. And in fact, it's something you do have to think about, in establishing the contractual relationships is, do you have a mechanism that allows the flexibility to survive something like that? Because you don't necessarily want to just fire a developer because there's literally no market for the product that they want to create. So, thinking about that eventuality and building some flexibility into the contract is important.
Last question here. So,
I think the city of Burlingame did an RFP several years ago for the parking lots, and so I guess the developer wasn't able to proceed. Is that what happened? So then they brought it back, and it's reminding me a little bit of Los Altos.
Yeah.
Like, do you do the parking lots or do you do something larger, which is what...
I think it was, I think it was less an issue about the developers than the city itself. I think the city began to have some ambivalence about the objectives of the project. I think they didn't get, I think they were less excited by the development proposals than they hoped they would be. And that, along with kind of some fundamental, lack of clarity about objectives, which is kind of what we talked about, is what sort of led to the end of that process. As I said, I think some version of that will come back again. I don't know when that's going to happen, but the reality is they do have, there is a lot of value in those parking lots, and there's a lot of different ways to develop those in ways that are advantageous to the city, and they have some particular public needs that they have to address.
well, we thank you very much. We tried to end on time, and we were over time, so thank you.